Hi, my name is Stu Bamick, and my life is all about helping people understand all of life from God's perspective. In the last message, we talked about fear, and that message was about the source of fear, the root of fear. Where does fear really come from? We can't deal with fear until we know a little bit about its characteristics and its nature and its origins in our lives. In this message, I'd like to talk about how we can overcome this fear in our lives. And I'm going to give you 3 practical steps in which to do that. As you'll recall, we've been looking at the story of David and Goliath in this series on the life of David. Goliath represents the fear in our lives. It's big, it's overwhelming, it's much stronger than we are. We can't overcome it. The valley is the valley of the shadows, of the darkness. It's desolate, it's barren, it's remote. It's a place where people go alone. It's a veritable no man's land where Goliath, the giant representing the fear, is shouting out, "Come on! Come and try to get me, because I can beat you, I can overwhelm you, I can flatten you in a heartbeat." And there we find this story of the Philistines and the Israelites on these 2 ridges, and this valley in between with a giant saying, come to me, come on, face me. And everybody's afraid to do that, except that surprisingly and unexpectedly, this young shepherd boy shows up with lunch for his brothers. And there they are in the valley. And David is saying to Saul that his faith, David's faith, overcomes the fear in his life, that faith fights fear. So let me give you 3 ways in which I believe that faith fights fear. And the first is this, that our faith has a spiritual identity to it, a spiritual identity. In 1 Samuel 17, verse 37, we read these words, "And David said, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." When Saul says, I'm afraid to fight the giant, all of my great warriors are afraid to fight the giant. Why would you, a simple shepherd boy, be willing to come here and fight this giant? And David said, well, because I am a shepherd boy. I'm nothing but a shepherd boy. I fight bears and lions for a living. I'm out there all by myself in the wilderness, watching over my sheep. It's just me and God has proven over and over and over again that He can be trusted. When the time comes for my faith to be tested, I am fully aware and fully confident and fully assured of the time-tested reality that God has provided for me over and over and over again throughout the course of my lifetime. Faith has this spiritual history to it. Faith is not dependent, I want you to catch this now, faith is not dependent on the size or the power or the strength of the giant, of the fear, or the size of the odds. Faith is dependent upon the spiritual activity of God in our lives, so that we can say with confidence, God has been active. I have a spiritual history. As I look back over my life, I am already assured that God can be trusted. And you know, this is an amazing thing when giants step into our lives. King Saul, all King Saul does is he looks at the size of the giant. It's overwhelming to me. I can't deal with that. But David, the shepherd boy, he doesn't look at the size of the giant. He looks back in his life at the power of God, the activity of God in his life. I took a simple amount of time in the last couple of weeks to go over a list. This is a great activity to do. I went over a list over the last 10 years of where I found myself in impossible places, in those valleys, facing those giants. And I made a list of time after time after time after time where God had delivered me. That he seemed to be silent, but he was not still. He was active. He was working. And God brought me from one place to another over and over and over and over and over again. I am confident in my life, looking at my spiritual history, that God can be trusted because of my spiritual history in my life. And I'm going to encourage you to make a list over the last 10 years of your life of the places you found yourself in, the giants and the valleys, and how God has delivered you from those valleys and from those giants and brought you to a new place once we face God in our lives. Face the giants and the fear in our lives. Once we recognize that God has been active, that we have a spiritual history in our lives. Now, I want us to turn to the second way in which we can rely on the second principle, the second reason why our faith can fight fear in our lives. Now, not only does faith have a spiritual history to it, faith that fights fear, but it also has a spiritual identity to it. Saul tries to put armor on David, Saul's armor, the armor of a king on him, the armor of a soldier, a helmet of bronze, a coat of mail, a big sword. This is Saul's way to fight the giants, but it's not David's way, and it's not God's way. David could hardly move when he put on the armor of another person and assumed another identity. He said to Saul, "This is not me. I can't go with these things. I'm not used to them. I'm not..." Saul, in all respect to your office and your position, I'm not a soldier. I'm a shepherd boy. This is your suit. It's not my suit. This is your way. It's not my way. I don't fit in someone else's armor. What a great principle. That God equips us and uniquely makes us that we have our own way of fighting fear with God. We don't fight it by trying to copy somebody else and mimic somebody else. No. We stand up and we fight God with the equipment and the armor that God has uniquely given to us. And what is that for David? Well, in the ancient armies, there were three levels or three groups of warriors. There were the bowmen. They could shoot up to a range of 150 yards with deadly accuracy when an army would be charging them. And then there were the infantry with the heavy armor on them and the shields and the swords that Saul was trying to equip David with. But there was a third component to those armies. Over and over again in history, we see this component. They are called slingers. They are often the key to battle. They have a leather pouch and smooth stones and a rope to sling those stones. They slung them like a softball pitcher underhand. It would swing them until they developed momentum, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. We find them mentioned in 2500 BC as slingers in the epic battle between Egypt and Assyria. We find them, Homer mentions them in 400 BC with the Greek infantry as severely suffering from the Persian slingers as they try to reach them and attack them. But most significantly, over and over and over again, you might be interested to know that we find this group of slingers over and over again mentioned in the Bible. And David is one of those slingers. Now, this is what I really get excited about, this concept of the slingers. We find them over and over again in the Bible. Just a couple for instances. First Chronicles chapter 12 verse 2 says, there were bowmen who could shoot arrows, and then there were those who could sling stones with either the right or the left hand. Judges 20 chapter 20, verse 16 says, among the army of Israel, this great army that's assembled, and all of these warriors, there were 700 picked men who were left-handed. Possibly David was left-handed and played musical instruments with his left hand and wrote with his left hand. And every one of those 700 men could sling a stone at a hair and not miss it. The power of a slinger. They would throw underhand like a modern-day softball pitcher. They would whip that rope around and round with a pouch at the end of it, wider and wider circles, faster and faster and faster and faster, until they released that rock and hurled it the size of a golf ball at their enemy. The Israeli army estimates that the velocity of a single stone of a slinger would be similar to a .45 caliber bullet. They could kill at 100 yards. Experienced slingers could hit a bird in flight. Now David saw himself as God saw him, as a shepherd, as a slinger. This was his identity. He was a slinger. He did not try to become someone else when he faced the giants in the valleys. He did not try to wear someone else's armor. He understood that God had made him unique and special and had spent his time, his life, preparing him for this moment in his way with what he knew how to do best, with his strength in his spiritual identity. And the question becomes, how has God made you and me? Don't lose sight of how God has equipped us with power. Don't lose power by losing sight of who we are, our spiritual identity. David said, I know who I am, and I know where I came from. I'm a slinger. And that leads us to the third dynamic of what it really is to be one who understands how faith can fight fear in our lives. So faith has a spiritual history to it. It has a spiritual identity. And this gets really good. Faith has a spiritual abandonment to it. Abandonment. 1 Samuel says, 17 verse 48 says, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. Now get this, listen. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put in his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Don't you love this passage? That David, when the giant of fear came into the valley of darkness, David ran quickly towards the giant. There is this sense of abandonment, complete abandonment. Goliath has 200 pounds of heavy armor on him, designed for close-range combat. But that very armor, as he has it on him in that valley that day, immobilizes him. He can't move. His strength became a liability. This is what fear does. It tries to fool us and to trick us. But the reality is this. The reality is that the giant never had a chance against a slinger. Slingers beat giants every time. Well, don't fear our giants. Run toward them. Faith is an action. Faith does something. You can't see faith. If I say I'm a person of faith, you can't see faith. You couldn't open me up and find faith in here somewhere. The only way you know I have faith is by what I do. Faith is an action. Noah preached a sermon about faith for 125 years with a hammer and a saw in his hands before there was ever a single drop of rain. Faith is an action. The Bible doesn't consider a faith known until it is a faith that is experienced and put into action. David runs toward his faith. Faith fights fear every time. Decades ago, I had a fear that really paralyzed me. I was claustrophobic. Anytime I get into a dark space, my heart would start to beat, my mind would race. I would feel that I'm going to lose control, and I had to get out of there. Concurrently with that fear, I decided to go to attend from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, to study for a Doctor of Ministry degree. And I dreaded the day that I had to get on the airplane to get out there, because one of the greatest fears I had was the fear of the claustrophobic feeling of being in a fuselage of an airplane and not being able to get out at 25 or 30 or 40,000 feet. It paralyzed me, disabled me. The tyranny of fear in our lives prevents us from doing the kinds of things that God wants us to do. And I remember the day that I dreaded, that I went out to the airport and I was there in the waiting area all by myself, ready to board that plane. I could see the time ticking down to when it was time to board the plane. Finally, the stewardess made the announcement, it's time to get in line, and I got in line and I froze. I froze in line. I said, I cannot walk down that jetway. I can't do it. I froze so much that everybody got down the runway, down the jetway, and I was the last person standing there. The door was about to close. The stewardess said to me, are you getting on the plane? Because I need to close the door right now. And I had a decision to make, to walk in faith or to walk in fear. To walk in faith or to live in fear. And I took a step and another step and another step. I walked down that jetway. I walked through the doorway. I went almost to the back of the airplane and got my seat and strapped my seatbelt on. I was pouring with sweat. I was literally scared to death. I'm going to be on this airplane now for the next 4 to 5 hours. And I can tell you on that flight that every minute seemed like a lifetime. I don't know how I did it. I just lived in terror and fear, a panic attack, full-blown panic attack. When I got off the airplane, I was to spend 2 weeks there at Fuller, and I realized, oh my goodness, I've got to get back on this airplane and fly home. It's the only way I can get home. So I did my classes. I met some amazing people. God spoke to me over and over and over again during that week, so much so that I was able to get on the airplane and fly home because I had a vision about starting a church, which I did. God used me to do with a group of people, and it's a church that's still flourishing and active and alive to this very day, and has changed thousands of people's lives. And I attribute that to the fact that if I had not gotten on that plane, I would have stayed where I was and never moved forward. And nothing would have happened or changed in my life. It was a defining moment for me. It was a lifetime teaching that faith fights fear. There has to be this element of abandonment to it, of simply stepping towards and running towards our fear and seeing what God will do using our spiritual history and our spiritual identity. Run towards the fear. I've lived a lot of my life in fear. And I have learned through my spiritual history and my spiritual identity that faith always overcomes fear. It always does. Run toward it. Run towards it. So faith has a spiritual history. God has protected me. He has provided for me. What is your story? What is your story of how God has worked in your life in the last 10 to 20 years? Faith has a spiritual identity. For David, it was that God made me a slinger. That's who I am. Who are you? Who am I? How has God made us? What strengths has He given to us to fight the fear in our lives? And faith has a dimension of spiritual abandonment to it. God has called me to move forward. And the question he's asking is, are you willing to take the next step to face your fear? So that's the story of David and Goliath. That's the root source of where fear comes from in our lives. And these are three principles by which I believe you can overcome that fear. And you might be interested to know that I have no fear whatsoever of being in closed spaces or flying. In fact, I love to fly today because faith in God has overcome my fear. And that's my prayer for you as well.